Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Once again, our tradition is at this time to go around and introduce ourselves. I suggest that you pause a little before the next person so that you can learn the name. If you have it. Again, my name is Waldo.
My name is Dennis.
My name is Tony.
Jack. Kevin.
My name is Cass.
I'm David. I'm Brad. My name is David.
I'm Rob.
I'm Ted. Peter.
My name is Clint.
George.
And Warren.
I'm Richard.
Lee.
Jim. I'm Kay.
My name is Roy.
Jeff.
My name is Tom.
Francesco. Matthew.
My name is Ray.
Larry.
I'm Shantanu.
My name is Douglas.
And it is my pleasure now to introduce our speaker today, who's been here a few times before. That's Dale Borglum, if I pronounced it correctly. He's the founder and executive director of the Living Dying Project. He's a pioneer in the conscious dying movement and has worked directly with people with life-threatening illnesses and their families for over 30 years. In 1981, Dale founded the first residential facility for people who wished to die consciously in the United States, the Dying Center. He has taught and lectured extensively on the topics of spiritual support for those with life-threatening illness, caregiving as a spiritual practice, and healing at the edge of illness, of death, of loss, of crisis. He is the co-author of Journey of Awakening, a meditator's guidebook, and has taught meditation for the last 35 years. So, welcome.
It's a pleasure to see so many old friends and maybe some new friends. As the gracious introduction pointed out, I am a guide to working with people who are approaching the end of their lives. And it's been my experience that with very few exceptions, the most beautiful Americans I've ever met are people who are almost dead. People who only have a few days or weeks to live because they have gone beyond their fear. They're no longer afraid of what somebody's going to think about them, or are they going to make enough money, or are they going to be happy? Today I'd like to talk about fear or faith. When I was in India with Ram Dass, he came up with this saying, faith, comma, no fear, fear, comma, no faith. And I work with dying people really not because I'm some great altruistic saint myself, but because I want to be free. I want to go beyond fear. And being around people who are looking at the possibility that they might be dead soon is a deep inspiration to awakening. One of my first meditation teachers, Trungpa Rinpoche, said that until one comes into intimate contact with death, one's spiritual practice will have the quality of you being a dilettante. So you or I can meditate till our knees fall off, as people often do at Spirit Rock Meditation Center right over the hill from where I live in Marin. And if you really don't know you're going to die, then one can create a more efficient personality structure, be a little happier, make a little more money, get maybe a slightly better quality of mind states. But this deep freedom that is the abiding message of Buddhism will not be available. The motivating truth, you're going to die when you don't know when, is often contemplated before someone begins spiritual practice, at least in Tibetan Buddhism. You're going to die, but you don't know when. Now, could anything be more intellectually obvious than that truth? Obviously, we're going to die, but we don't know when. But if we really, really knew that, if we didn't know that we were going to get out of this room alive today, that one of us or all of us, person sitting next to you, you might die in the next hour, how would it affect the way we were relating to each other, we were relating to our breath, to what's going on in this room right now? So as I suggested, there is this question that is, I think, crucial to spiritual practice. How deep does our faith go? And where our faith doesn't go, then there is fear. All fear is fear of death, because fear is that place where there is another, something out there to be afraid of. As long as there is no other, there is no fear. And that sense of self and other, that being caught in separateness, is the place that we're afraid to die. So all fear is fear of death, and fear of death is equal to lack of enlightenment. So if we can begin to work with that core fear of death, then possibly enlightenment isn't some theoretical goal floating somewhere off at the end of all those books on your shelf. But is some real possibility that is maybe here right now in this room. In fact, it's something that we don't even have to find. There's a fundamental human ambiguity, and the ambiguity is as follows: that from the standpoint of the fixated ego structure, the fixated ego structure that's based in fear, we're trying to grasp at feel-good experiences and reject feel-bad experiences. But from the standpoint of our true nature, there is a quality that can be called groundlessness or spaciousness or even love, if I can dare use that word here in this Buddhist room. There is this quality of our nature that is always there, so that at times we're caught in the separateness. We look around the room, older, younger, bigger, smaller, male, not too many females in the room today apparently, more hair, less hair, all those differences. Is there also a way we can look around the room and see that which is the same? But even more importantly, is there a way we can look into our own experience? And yes, the content is changing moment to moment to moment. Sometimes there's agitation, sometimes there's calmness, sometimes there's happiness, sometimes there's sadness. Sometimes there's pain in the body, sometimes there's not. We can go beyond being fixated with the content of our experience and begin to become interested in our relationship with experience and actually begin to have a compassionate relationship with our experience. But eventually we can be with the nature of experience itself. That no matter what the experience is, whether it's happy, sad, agitated, or calm, does each experience have this quality, this nature of groundlessness, of spaciousness, of openness? And obviously, what I'm saying is that the answer is yes. But we have this very strong, often unconscious, even addictive desire, urge to get away from that feeling of openness and spaciousness, because it is the direct enemy in a certain way of the ego structure. When we're resting in spaciousness, when we're resting in true nature of things, when we're resting in openness, there's nothing for the ego to grab onto. The ego, in fact, is not a thing, it's a verb. It's a construct. It's something we do. Try to find it. Good luck. Okay. So, can we begin to be aware of that urge as it arises? That urge to run away from being present. It's often very subtle. Sometimes it shows its face as an addiction in ways of using our mind, of putting certain things into our mouth, of being in certain kinds of relationships. But often it's much more subtle than that. That you're resting in that quality of spaciousness, and the spaciousness becomes spacious enough, long enough, big enough, and the ego structure says, wait a minute, what about me? Let's start thinking so I can feel reified. Let's start having a problem. Let's start having some aversion or grasping here so I can feel uncomfortably happy again. Okay. I facilitate groups around the Bay Area, small ongoing groups. Several people in the room have been in those groups. Apparently they've all graduated, or at least they think they have. And lately in our groups we've been talking about this edge, this urge to run away. And I've encouraged people to take a vow, to look at one way that you habitually run away from being present. I took the vow to not think or say anything negative about another human being with a closed heart. And in the current political climate, that is not an easy thing to do. Okay. But even walking down the street, I got here half an hour early today. I was walking around the Mission District. And as you know, there's very interesting people walking up and down the sidewalk. It is so easy to jump into that place of, well, look at the way that person carries their body. Look at the way that person's dressed. Look at the way that person just threw some trash on the sidewalk. Each time I get lost in judgment, the ego structure is very happy. It's being reified. Can I just be walking down the sidewalk and be walking down the sidewalk? Other people have taken vows not to think or say anything negative about themselves. One person, who I'm going to have lunch with after I leave here today, took a vow to give up pornography for the rest of his life. He lasted about 2 weeks. Okay. It's not that the vow is something that you're not going to break, but the notion is beginning to become focused on that place where we tend to run away from being present. That urge to get away from that quality of spaciousness. So that again and again, I or you or whoever will break the vow, but I'm beginning to notice that tendency in myself to judge as a way of thinking, oh, there's me and there's them, creating that sense of separateness. And as I get better at noticing that, I get better at noticing the other ways that I'm running away from being present. So can we begin to notice this tension between resting in spaciousness and wanting to get away from it? Eventually, having compassion for that place where we do want to run away makes this process so very much easier. Can I not close my heart to myself when I notice that I've judged? I used to be a mathematician, and I began to notice how there's a geometric progression here. That first stage of looking at that urge is learning to rest at one point, this point of being present. And compassion then is learning to rest in this horizontal plane of compassion for all beings, including myself. So it's not just me watching my own process, but I look around the room and I see beauty, I see uncried tears in certain faces, maybe in all faces, in my own face if I were to look in a mirror. And that motivation of compassion, for me at least, makes it much easier to begin working with that urge to run away. We often have an addiction to fear. I think everyone's addicted to fear. Even though being beyond fear is such a wonderful and spacious and comforting state to be in, fear itself is often more comfortable. I was listening to a tape by a Zen teacher, Sherry Huber. Some of you have heard of her. She's a wonderful teacher. And somebody asked her the following question. This guy said, I'm an entrepreneur, and my friends say I'm self-sabotaging. Every time I start up a business, it gets pretty successful, but just before it gets really successful, I do something and it falls apart and I have to start over again. And my friends say I'm sabotaging myself, but why would I do that? I don't want to sabotage myself. I really want to be successful. And what she said to this fellow was that to be somebody who's really successful, who you think you are has to die. And it's more comfortable for you to be almost successful and then sabotage yourself than to leap into this unknown quality of being this different human being. You have this conditioning that you're somebody who's an almost successful guy. And being that other person, even though your mind, your ego structure says, oh, isn't that a wonderful thing to be successful, is so frightening because it's being somebody who you don't know. It's dying to who you are. So I mentioned before that this talk could be called Faith or Fear. What can we have faith in that will allow us to work with fear? And in my looking at this, I've come up with 3 levels of faith. The first level, the most obvious one, is can we have faith in our own basic human goodness? All those times when you have reached out to help your mother or help your brother or just spontaneously done something good for another person. Buddhism is really fundamentally based on the assumption that we are whole. That yes, the wholeness is again and again covered over by conditioning that creates neurotic ways of dealing with things, contracted ways of working with our experience. But there is this fundamental wholeness. There is this place where we are good human beings. So that all we have to do is sit down, shut up, and pay attention, right? And if you do that long enough, there is this process of purification that goes on, watching the breath, doing whatever practice you're doing, and one gets more and more in touch with that quality of basic human goodness. So can you, or could that guy, that entrepreneur, or could I, have so much faith in that basic human goodness that when this fear begins to arise, this fear to, this habitual, this addictive urge to get away from being present, when that arises, we have that faith that, no, I don't have to do that. I'm a good guy. I'm a good human being. I have this core of basic good humanity. A second and, I think, deeper level of faith is having faith in the Dharma. Having faith that this process actually works. That, have you noticed, for instance, that when you let go, when you pay attention to a place where there is contraction, and you just let go, you let be, you open, that it takes one beyond suffering. So that you watch the breath, you're a meditator, you've been watching the breath for a few decades, you've watched how many million breaths along the way, we don't really know. And you finally begin to get the notion that, hey, it's just letting go takes me beyond suffering. Often before practice in certain schools of Buddhism, people take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. We have faith in what's called the triple gem. Having faith in the Buddha, not Gautama Buddha, the historical guy, but having faith that freedom exists. It's not some theoretical construct. It's real. It's as real as the floor. Having faith in the Dharma, which is what I was just talking about, that this process of paying attention, cultivating compassion, leads to freedom. And maybe more important of all, having faith in the Sangha, the satsang, having faith in the community of seekers. The Buddha's attendant and cousin Ananda came to the Buddha and said, "Oh Buddha, I have heard that the Sangha is fully half of the spiritual path." And the Buddha said, "Oh no, Ananda, it is all of the path." What we're talking about doing is almost impossible to do on your own. There are a few rare human beings with a very light karmic veil who just see the way things are and their mind opens. But for most of us, it's a gradual process of purification. So that we come together in this room, we go to 12-step programs, we go to small groups led by me, whatever it is that you choose to do. And by being with like-minded seekers, we find the faith to do what is often very difficult work. And it's not only the people in this room, it's not only the people that are practicing right now at this moment, but it's going back in the lineage. Dogen, who started Soto Zen, my teacher, Nimkaroli Baba, Dingo Kensei, whose book I'm reading right now, that my teacher, my teacher's teacher, my teacher's teacher's teacher, those blessings are in this room right now. Any teacher you've had and his or her teachers and back and back and back, so that we can have faith in that lineage and that these beings have deeply dived into the lineage and found that it works, that there is freedom. Okay. The third level of faith, the most deep level of faith, is true nature, is wholeness. So that we're starting out at this one point geometrically. I'm looking at my addiction, my urge to run away, here in the present moment, and then I begin to spread out horizontally with compassion for all beings. But now we're going to bring in finally the verticality, the vertical dimension. Is there something? Is there some quality of wholeness? Is there some true nature that we can rest in that's beyond what the mind can understand? Suzuki Roshi, the founder of San Francisco Zen Center, said the most important thing is finding the most important thing. What is the most important thing for you? So that avoiding or resisting fear, being afraid of fear, is a greater problem than fear itself. Until we are fully free, we will be afraid. But can we not be afraid of fear in spite of what Franklin Roosevelt said? The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Not true. Can we be with fear as it arises? That's probably the most difficult spiritual task, to be with fear. What does it feel like in your body? Usually fear, almost always fear, is projected. It's rarely felt directly. I'm afraid of you. I'm afraid of that happening. I'm afraid of what Donald Trump is going to do to the environment. I'm afraid that traffic is getting worse. Whatever it is. Okay. No. Can we be with what fear actually feels like? Can we find the ability to be with anxiety, fear of fear, in an ongoing way? So every time you act, it is either motivated by anxiety or by faith. Fear or faith. When we act, is there some contraction? I want to have people like me. I want to get more. I want to be distracted so I don't feel that spaciousness. Or is the action coming freely out of love, out of faith in the triple gem, out of faith in your own true nature? So that we can begin to pay attention to that motivation for action itself. My experience is that when I'm afraid, I'm not grounded. And that there's very little talk about grounding in spiritual discourse, because all these Buddhist texts were written by and for Asian people thousands of years ago who were walking around barefoot, didn't have an iPhone, and loved their mommy and daddy, right? So that there was no question about being grounded. I read one person felt that the most dangerous invention of all time is the shoe, because it disconnects us from the electrical connection with Earth. That people are going around up. People are going around trying to figure things out because of fear, rather than dropping down into a sense of being grounded and whole. So that one way of dealing with fear, one somatic way of working directly with anxiety and fear, is learning to inhabit the lower part of your body, learning to breathe out and down into the earth and receive the qualities of nourishment and support that are groundedness. Grounding is learned in the first 2 years of life. And to the extent that you or I had any trauma in the first 2 years of your life, to the extent that your mother was not an enlightened being, if it's not one thing, it's your mother. To the extent that your mother was not an enlightened being, and at times had her own needs that prevented her from being there fully for yours, then probably you are not fully grounded. Let me tell you one or two things that happened to me. My earliest memory, some of you have heard this story more times than you want to remember, was picking up a hairpin, a woman's hairpin off of the rug before I could talk or walk. I was crawling across the floor. I can still remember the pattern on the rug. Sunlight's coming in from the windows on the right side. My dad's shaving in his sleeveless t-shirt. And right in front of me on the wall were two holes. It's called an electrical outlet. And lo and behold, those two holes were exactly as far apart as this thing I just picked up off the floor. And I thought, without words, isn't this great? Isn't this amazing? Those two things go in those two holes. And I put it in there. And it knocked me across the room, my earliest memory. By following my curiosity, I got a very rude electrical awakening. Another thing that happened to me was I dropped a glass baby bottle and it broke. My parents were feeding me on a schedule. And by the time they could sterilize another bottle and heat up some formula, it was past the time that the schedule said they could feed me, so they waited 4 hours. And I was crying in hunger the whole time. This story is thought of as a humorous family tale. That, oh, isn't it funny, we didn't feed Dale for 4 hours. But what was I thinking at the time? Are these people ever going to feed me again? I had really loving parents. I had great parents. I could not ask for better parents. But those things happened to me. Similar things happened to you. So it was conditioned that the world's not a safe place. That I should be afraid, that I should really pay attention. So that as long as you're just paying attention to your thoughts and your breath, there's a breath, there's another breath, there's a thought, there's a bunch of thoughts, back to the breath. Can you get beyond that? Can you get underneath that and feel that place where you feel the world is not a safe place? So that I did a lot of meditating, a lot of long retreats. I went to India, I went to Tibet, went to India several times. And I was still a very neurotic person. I was still a recovering PhD mathematician. And I got involved then in some somatic work where I began to learn about being grounded. And it really changed things. I began to understand, I began to feel in my body this place of not being grounded, this lack of faith in my body. And as I was able to start dropping down into the body and feeling grounded, feeling a sense of support, then this place that had been crying in fear, reaching out for embrace for so very long, began to relax. And all that agitation began to relax because I wasn't so concerned about getting starved to death or shocked like I had been before. Another way we could talk about this same discussion is in terms of grief. That we feel through fear the sense of separation. Walt Whitman said, sometimes touching another human being is almost more than I can bear. One of my favorite quotes. Sometimes touching another human being is almost more than I can bear. You've experienced that, I've experienced that. But before the talk began today, I was out there on the couch and some of my old friends came in, and part of me wanted to get ready for the talk and part wanted to be with my old friends, and I touched them, but it wasn't almost more than I could bear. I was able to bear it. Does that make sense to hear what I'm saying? That I didn't completely dissolve in love. I wanted to hold it together so I could give a good talk today. And let me do that now. Oh, okay. But what I'm saying is that we're going around in our lives with this low level of anxiety or this low level of grief. Sometimes there's a big grief. Somebody you love dies. Or sometimes there's a really big fear where you lose a bunch of money, or you're in an accident, or somebody close to you has some big crisis or something. But what I would suggest is that all of us are getting comfortable in a low level of background grief or anxiety that allows us to think that it's the nature of things to feel separate from each other. And can we begin to touch that fear slowly, gradually, with enough faith that we can begin to embrace it with compassion? Thomas Merton said, love and prayer are learned in the hour when prayer becomes impossible and the heart turns to stone. So that this quality of faith really has a lot to do with love. It is the antidote to fear in a very real sense. Love and faith are obviously deeply connected. Rumi said, grief is the garden of compassion. a garden is a place where something wonderful and nourishing grows. We live in a garden of grief. Can compassion begin to grow out of that? And it can only begin to grow out of that if we can be with the grief itself, if we can be with the anxiety itself. Be at that one point so that it can begin to then spread out horizontally. And then eventually this vertical connection with wholeness. And vertical doesn't just mean up, it also means down. It also means being with the dark face of the sacred. It means being able to embrace what's going on in our country right now. I had a massage last week. I get a massage once a month. And I asked my massage therapist, are a lot of your clients really stressed out by what's going on politically? And she said, everybody who comes in is so stressed out by what's going on politically that they say, I need massages every day practically. Okay. So, if we didn't have this going on, we would find something else to be stressed out about. There's a Tibetan slogan, drive all blames into oneself. And that doesn't mean you blame yourself, but it means that as long as we blame the Republican administration or the weather or the traffic or your neighbors or whatever it is out there for how you're feeling, in that moment we can't start working with this dichotomy of fear and faith. We're blaming the external environment. We have to reclaim that responsibility, the ability to respond, and be with that quality of fear in our bodies. Okay. Sometimes touching another human being is almost more than I can bear. Let's open this up to discussion and questions. Thomas.
Hello, Neil.
Hi.
I may have asked you this before, but remind me. Do you distinguish between fear of death and fear of dying? Because to me, death is a state, like the state of being dead. I'm not too distressed by that thought, but just like whatever it is, flatline or something else. But dying is a process, or, there's a lot of uncertainty about when that will happen, what the process will be, will I be lingering, will there be suffering, all those things. So that's my question.
Okay.
Or is it all the same thing?
It's kind of all the same thing, I think. We can use death in two words. Death happens physically when the brain and the heart stop. It takes a minute or two. The spiritual dying process can take place, can begin well before somebody physically dies, and certainly continue well after somebody physically dies. But even though you might not have an intellectual fear of death, and you say, well, death is just flatlining and what's to worry about, any place where you're afraid of dying, or you're afraid of being embarrassed, or you're afraid of anything, is going to be there at the moment of death. The New York Times did a survey, what are you most afraid of? Number 1 was speaking in public, number 3 was dying, I can't remember number 2. Okay. So if I'm afraid of speaking in public, if I'm afraid of being embarrassed because I might make a fool of myself, that place in me that's separate from my audience is going to be there when I'm dying. It's going to be there. So when you talk about fear of dying, I assume you're talking about the incapacity, the pain, the confusion that can happen as you're dying. And in a very real sense, this moment and every moment is preparation for dying. So death and dying are kind of two different things, but fundamental fear is all based in fear of death. Fear of physical pain is fear of nausea, fear of whatever it is that same core fear. And as your question suggests, it can come out in so many different expressions. But the kind of the point of this talk today was there is this subtle place where we can work with the core of it. That urge to run away, that urge to get away from the sense of openness and spaciousness and true nature that we are. So can we get subtleness let me start that sentence over again. So that instead of being fixated with here's a thought and there's a breath and there's an emotion, can we at times at least begin to be with that place where there's either faith or fear? There's that we begin to acknowledge that urge to run away from being present, and then not act on it, and then become intimately familiar with what it feels like. What does it feel like, that core fear? Other questions? David.
Hi, Dan. I want to ask about faith for you personally. Have you always had faith, or is it something that developed?
No. I was raised in a very traditional Christian household. My parents were both very religious. My faith still wavers. I've had the great blessing to be with some of the greatest meditation teachers of the late 20th century. And any faith that you see in me really comes from my deep connection with them. I was with Suzuki Roshi and Trungpa and Maharaji and Anandamai and Dingo Kensei and the previous Karmapa and on, beings who were awake. And in being with them, faith awakened in me. I had to go to India to start loving Christ. And Maharaji gave me a mantra that is a Christian mantra, which was the last thing in the world I wanted. I wanted a sexy Hindu mantra. And I didn't want to start having to think about Christ again. That's the last thing I wanted. But there it is. So, but as I said, there are these levels of faith, and that it's an ongoing practice to cultivate faith and to be courageous enough to be with where faith falters, where we become afraid. Do we have to be afraid of fear? Can we admit those places where we're lost in fear? And can we bring love to those places? Right. Can we bring compassion to those places? Some other hands were coming up back there in the back.
Well, I haven't had as much experience as you have, obviously. But it seems to me that it seems a little limiting to say faith or fear. Why not faith and fear?
Because when I have faith, my fear dissolves. I mean, there might be a moment there where I feel fear and faith arises, and they're both at the same time. But I don't know, maybe you have a different experience than I do. But if I have faith in the Dharma, if I have faith in, dare I say, God, if I have faith in love, if I have faith in self with a capital S, there's no fear. What's there to be afraid of? There can still be death, there can still be pain, there can still be all kinds of problematic, difficult circumstances arising, but I don't need to be afraid of them. So that cancer doesn't cause suffering. Resistance to cancer causes suffering. Divorce doesn't cause suffering. Resistance to divorce causes suffering. Trump doesn't cause suffering. Resistance to Trump causes suffering. And if we can begin to make that distinction and not say, well, I'm suffering because I have cancer or I fell down and got hurt or whatever it might be, but that there's resistance going on, there's fear of what I'm feeling now, then I do think that I'm not asking you to believe me. I would ask you to explore this interplay between faith and fear and see what you find. Oswaldo.
My best friend's younger sister died of cancer, painful death apparently, one day ago. He happens to be coming over to visit. I spent a few days with me over here, he's flying in from Colorado. What advice would you give me for me to be as supportive to him in this difficult time while we're together, spending time over here?
Great question. Is your friend somebody who practices?
In the Christian tradition, but he's very open. He's from Boulder, Colorado, so I should say.
Well, then he might. If he's from Boulder, okay. Okay. The greatest gift you can give him or anyone or yourself is resting in this quality of spaciousness and trusting that what you do or say that might come out of that openness will be the best thing. So that worrying about what can I say because your sister died, trying to be sure you're doing the right thing is probably not meeting him or yourself at the deepest place possible. So can you have the faith that even though he has this deep grief, that you can be this living invitation to be open, to be loving? Certainly there are dualistic practices that one can do. One of them, which I like, is asking provocative questions rather than saying, I'm here to help you, I'll do anything you need, but say, you can ask somebody, what is it you need right now? And allow then the other person to set the implied contract. I can tell the story about my father where many years ago, he and I and my girlfriend and my mother were driving around on a beautiful summer day near Half Moon Bay somewhere, and I said, Dad, I'm going to teach a workshop next weekend in Berkeley about conscious dying. Do you want to hear what I'm going to talk about? And he said, isn't it a beautiful day today? Apparently he didn't want to talk about it. I have no idea why he didn't want to have me telling him about dying, but anyway, he didn't. Okay. But then I was in this hospital room a week before he died of metastatic prostate cancer. And I said to him, I asked him, Dad, what do you think is going on with you right now? What's going on in your body? And he could have said, isn't it a beautiful day today? But what he said was, I don't know, what do you think? He invited me in. And I said, well, I really hope I'm wrong, but from what I know medically, I think you're dying. And he said, that's the way it feels to me, let's talk about it. And he and I had the most real conversation that man and I ever had. He said, go home and tell your mother I'm dying and I'd like to talk with her about it. So I drove 10 minutes from El Camino Hospital in Mountain View to my parents' house in Los Altos. And I said, Mom, Dad feels like he's dying and he wants to talk to you about it. And she said, no, he doesn't. Which tells you something about my childhood. I said, yes, he does. And I took her to the hospital and they talked and they cried and she climbed into bed with him. So by asking him a question, I mean, what do you think's going on right now? What's going on with your sister? What's going on with you? What do you want to talk about? Let him set the boundaries. And I'm sure he will if he loves and trusts you a bit. You've had your hand up a whole bunch of times, and I keep picking somebody else.
Yeah, I wonder if you could reiterate or rephrase the concept of groundlessness. Is that the same as spaciousness? I didn't get it.
Yeah. So there's this. Buddhism has so many different traditions, and fundamental to it all is impermanence. The nature of the mind is so. As an example, in Tibetan Buddhism, they say that the awakened mind has three qualities. One of them is boundlessness or spaciousness. Another one is great clarity, the knowing quality. And the third is naturally arising compassion and activity. So what I'm saying is that moment to moment to moment, there is this boundless, open, always changing, edgy, groundless quality. I mean, and it's kind of strange because I suggest getting grounded in the face of groundlessness, which nobody really called me on that one. But that's two different uses of the word ground there. So that by groundlessness, I mean there's nothing solid. There's no permanent self. There's no I. It's just consciousness meeting experience moment after moment after moment, or love meeting experience, or self awakening, or whatever you want to, whatever word there is. And that truth, that fundamental truth from the standpoint of all contemplative spiritual texts, is the ultimate bad news to the ego structure. So that there's this tension between the need of the ego structure to keep reifying itself and think that it's in control and in charge, when the ego structure doesn't even exist. It's got this very difficult job that, first of all, it doesn't exist, and because you're a spiritual person, you're trying to get rid of it anyway, right? So it's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place there, and there it is, and there it isn't. Okay, moving on. Yes.
I'm not quite sure how to phrase this question, but I'll give it my best shot. I wonder if you could describe what a good death is. And I want to append that about, okay, faith is in some ways a vague word. At least I see it that way. And because death is a great mystery, and we have just practically no clue about what goes on the other side, if there is an other side. A dying person with faith who's come to terms with his death, is that because he expects to have another type of existence on the other side, or he's okay if it's just oblivion and nothing else? Or can you kind of play with that?
Well, we've got 5 minutes. I'll see what I can do here in 5 minutes. But Stephen Levine, my dear friend and mentor in some ways, as you may know, died about 14 months ago. And he wrote all these wonderful books about dying and told all these wonderful stories about good deaths. I have been guiding people who are dying for almost 40 years now. And it's seldom that I get somebody dying a Stephen Levine death. There's almost always a lot of emotional material that people are dealing with as they're approaching the end of their lives. And this notion of a good death is, I don't know what to say here. It's kind of complicated. I mean, for some people, just being able to find closure with people they love, not be overly afraid, could be considered a good death. At the same time, I have been around a few people who as they were dying, seemed to let go of any sense of separateness and fear and die in a burst of light. All the spiritual scriptures say that we are enlightened now. There is nothing that you or I can find by doing a lot of spiritual practice that is not here now. I was teaching a workshop with Robert Thurman a little while ago, and somebody asked him, "Are you enlightened?" And he said, "Well, I don't think I'm enlightened right now, but I have complete faith that one day I will be enlightened. And from that point, I can look back at today and know that now I am enlightened." Okay, so what we're saying here is that there's this quality of consciousness where we're lost in separateness. I'm talking to you, you're over there, I'm over here. You have your history, I have my history. And in that dimension, you and I are going to die. At the same time, as we're dying, the separateness falls away. What remains is consciousness. My understanding of death, and I've been around some very great teachers who talked about things about what happens when you're alive, but also what happens when and after you die. Everything they said about living seems to be true, so I'm kind of assuming what they said about dying is also true. And that is that consciousness survives death, and that one of the first things that happens after you die is that there you are resting in consciousness. The Tibetans say this experience is seeing as light that's as bright as 1,000 suns. Very, very bright. So that we've talked today about fear and faith and working with suffering and compassion. There's another spiritual practice of working with love, of resting in openness, of being able to bear the light of 1,000 suns. Maybe we'll start out with 2 suns, work our way up to 3 and 4, right? But how much are we able to bear love? How much are we able to bear that sense of groundlessness or openness? And that will carry us through. So that we have this, through the dying process, we have this incredible advantage after we've died, that we don't have a body anymore that's separate from all the other bodies. What is found now is found then. Okay? So that can we find that which does not die in this moment? And then dying is just another moment of that. Once again, don't take my word for it. Begin to explore what is it that doesn't die. Stephen wrote this book with the wonderful title, Who Dies? ? And what is it that doesn't change moment to moment in your experience? Like right now, you're hearing the sound of my voice. And there's an awareness of these sounds coming into your ears. Your eardrum makes certain vibrations that goes into your brain, etc. What is it? So you're hearing. What is it that continues when I stop speaking?
Is that a rhetorical question or a real question?
It's up to you. Okay. So if you look at your breath, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, what continues between the out-breath and the in-breath? What's still there? Or between thoughts? Or during breaths or during thoughts? What is it that's always there? And is that going to stop because the brain and the heart stop functioning? With that final question, thank you all very much. It's 12 o'clock. I appreciate your kind attention. I should mention very briefly that I'm the director of the Living Dying Project. We have a wonderful website, livingdying.org, that has many talks, guided meditations, a lot of material by me, Joan Halifax, Stephen Levine, other people. I think it's the most complete site on the internet with information about conscious dying. There's information about ongoing groups, online workshops, and we have volunteers in San Francisco, Marin, Sonoma, Alameda, and Contra Costa counties, who offer free of charge emotional/spiritual support to people with life-threatening illnesses. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Dale. Are you gonna be hanging around for another half hour, I hope? Or?
For a bit.
Okay, so people might have a chance to maybe get one last question in, one-on-one. With several things that should be mentioning at this point. First of all, there's the Dana Bowl that will be passed around, which is used to support everything that we do as a Sangha. The expected contribution is $10 if you can afford it, or if you can, of course. Then we have the next speaker, which is going to be happening on April 2nd, is one of our own, Baruch Golden. He's been a long-time member of the Sangha, completed the Spirit Rock Community Dharma Leaders Program back in 2012. And he teaches Dharma to many setting groups around the Bay Area. Any other announcements from anybody, or comments if you care to make about yesterday's full-day event and how that went? I'm sorry I missed it.
The main talk from yesterday was recorded and will be up on the website. That's something.
Good. Okay, folks, with no more announcements then, let's do the dedication of merit. And you think I know it by heart, but since I'm speaking out loud, I better rely on some good detail. By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow, and may all live in equanimity without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that lives.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.